Well, hello, everyone. This is John Byrne with Poets&Quants. Thank you for joining us on a really special fireside chat that we're going to have with two people who know highly selective college admissions from the inside out. We have Eric Furta, who is he's been, head of admissions at both Columbia and UPenn. At Penn, he's been there for 12 years now and really knows the inner workings of what it takes to get into an elite school. And then we have someone who is a former education correspondent for the New York Times, who has written the book on highly selective college admissions. I have it here. It's called The Gatekeepers. You know, this came out in 2002. It's been through 25 printings. And actually it's a lyrical work. I'm going to tell you this. Jacques writes prose as if he were a lyricist. It's a delight to read, and it's filled with incredible informative insights. Jacques Steinberg, welcome. And the two of these characters have been spending time together of late to write a new book, which I think is really helpful for parents who are trying to navigate this anxiety-ridden journey of their junior and senior high school students into college. The new book is going to be published on September 22nd by Viking Penguin. It is called The College Conversation, a practical companion for parents to guide their children along the path to higher education. That's a long subtitle, guys.
Amazing it didn't get edited down, right?
But it does tell me something very clearly about the book, that there's real takeaway for parents to have the kinds of conversations that are often awkward and difficult with their kids. The book is divided into 5 key parts, all evolving around these conversations. It starts with conversations about the discovery phase. And I love the whole notion of sitting down at the kitchen table and discussing the 5 I's. We'll get to those. There are also the 4 C's. You guys are very tricky with those little, lists, including the big C, I will say, cost. And the simple things like, sitting down with your kids and saying, okay, here are the attributes I'm looking for in a college experience. So before we start, let me just welcome the two of you. It's a pleasure to have you here at Backstage, our undergraduate admissions event. I'm wondering, how the motivation for the book are often guided by so-called helicopter parents. And so they want to basically plow through every potential hurdle in their children's way. Did that motivate you to get together to do the book?
Yeah, I think that, it's first of all a pleasure to be here today, and the story I'm about to tell is true, and I hope you believe it, which is that I acknowledged my own son 3 years ago this past spring by coincidence, and my cell phone rang, and it was Eric Furta, who had no idea I was on a college tour with my son, and my son was glaring at me because I had stepped away from the tour to take this call. But of course, if Dean Furta is calling, it's probably worth stepping away from the tour. And I told him I had about 10 seconds and that I had to get back. And he said, we should write a book for parents going through this process. Go back to the tour. We'll talk about it later. And that was really where the idea was born. And what Eric later said to me was that we're particularly interested in helping parents who've never been through this process, including as applicants, but also parents who went through this as applicants so long ago that their information is probably a little bit dated. And was it possible with the sum of the parts of everything we had learned that we might be able to calm this process down a bit and provide some perspective?
Yeah, that's great. And I have heard from actual people who are in the admissions business, meaning the directors of admission at business schools in particular, who have gone through this process with their children in the transition to undergraduate school, and they've been shocked and surprised, even though they're in the business. So there's a lot to learn. Let's just talk about the do's and don'ts and start there. And then what I want to do is, almost bring you through a chronology where you bring the reader through your book. But what are the things that parents really should do, and what are the things that parents should never do?
Well, John, thanks for having me back. Really appreciate it when you had Dean Robertson on a few weeks ago as well. So great to be back here. And, I think in a lot of ways, the way that Jacques and I approach this book is kind of a culmination of so many experiences we had already had. And it really gets to the question that you're asking, whether this was, the Gatekeepers that Jacques wrote, or when he was with the New York Times with the Choice blog.
Right.
We were trying to provide information that I don't think fed into the hysteria of what's going on. And what I mean by that is those things that we don't have control over as a parent, as a student, as a potential applicant. But really, I think the do's are those things to focus on what you actually have some level of influence over. And I think really through the chronology and the arc of the book, that's what we tried to do step by step. Now, some families may come in a little bit earlier in the conversation. Some may come in maybe feeling that they're more towards the end of the conversation. They're actually applying and ready to get decisions. But I would say the big do is really focus on what you have some control and influence over, and everything else can consume you, and not to get wrapped up into that static and noise.
And one of the things that you as a parent have control over is the ground rules that you establish with your child. And so we don't spend a lot of time talking about helicopter parenting because we feel that parents shouldn't abdicate their role. You have expertise and experience and you've got skin in this game. On the other hand, there are things that more appropriately should be owned by your child. So one of the things that we say very early on is set some ground rules, set some boundaries, set some roles and
My screen froze. Did yours?
Okay, I'm still here.
Good. I think Jock's screen froze.
Okay. Well, we could maybe edit from there. And
Yeah, no problem. No problem. Yeah.
Sounds good. Hey, Jacques.
There you are. Hi, you froze up a little bit there.
Oh, sorry. And are we can you edit that out, or are we?
Oh yeah, no problem.
Okay.
We'll edit it out.
Okay.
Good. So let's start with a few exercises. Right from the beginning, that what a parent should do is jot down with their child a few key attributes that the child may think about what they're looking for. Is it a small environment, a large environment? Do they have any idea what they want to specialize in or major in? Talk about how you begin that conversation as a parent with your child.
Well, what was fun about, and Jacques and I, as we started this journey together, I'm not quite sure we knew we would come up with more than a dozen exercises or activities through the book, but we just started off in some ways that we felt would be kind of an icebreaker of sorts.
Yes.
For the child and parent, saying, without putting the name of a school down, why don't you just start putting down some attributes and characteristics so we could just get this conversation started. We say use an index card, you could use whatever you like, but we wanted to keep it really simple at first, John, and say, write down a few words that you think will encapsulate, the type of environment you'd like to go into. Some may dive right into academics. Some may dive into more the environmental factors of size of campus or distance from home or a particular type of program. And the point was that they were going to separate parent and child for a second and then come back and start the conversation by trying to find commonality, or in those places where I wrote something down as a child that's completely different that you wrote down as a parent.
Right. Now, inevitably, junior and senior high school students rarely know what they want to do. So there is a lack of direction. They're kind of aimless in terms of what they would like to study. Is part of the process getting them on track at this point, or is that really not part of the process?
What do you think of that, Jacques? I think as proponents of liberal arts education, we would say it's not so important, and we touch on that, the intrinsic value.
Yeah, I think that we first of all, we arm parents, hopefully, to be able to sort of facilitate the very conversation you're imagining there. And we assume no knowledge on the parent's part, and we assume no knowledge on the child's part. Let's pan back. Let's talk about four-year college and the value in that, but let's also talk about community college, or some sort of a hybrid where you start at community college and bridge. So just starting with those very, very basics, and then of course, you alluded to, we get into the C's, which are the qualities of an institution, and the I's, which are all about you, and trying to sort of help parents try to coax that information out and try to find some alignment.
In fact, the second activity in the book is about the five I's. Let's go through the five I's. What are they?
Well, for Jacques and I, at first it starts internal for the student, so it begins with the letter I, makes it really simple, later with the C's, college begins with the letter C. So really trying to keep it simple. And students may have their own idea, and we're just trying to have something to help them start thinking about themselves. But we have identity, interests, ideas, intellect, inspiration. And Jacques and I always had a lot of fun sitting around the table together, because we're like, is identity first or is ideas first? Which one are we, what order are we putting these things in? The fun part about having a conversation like this, or when you're up in front of an audience, is it doesn't really matter what order they're in, but we just want them to be prompts so students can be reflective.
And if
Right.
you pull on some of those, John, I mean, identity, being able to ask your child, perhaps for the first time, who are you? How do you define yourself? And what role could higher education play in getting you to the place you want to be? And then what clues does that give us for a school? In terms of interests, what are the things you like to do, both academically and non-academically? It's really important that we try to come up with a college list for you that sort of aligns with that. Intellect, how important is it to sort of intellectually challenge yourself, and what sort of settings do you sort of learn best in? So suddenly this big amorphous process starts to come, I think, a little bit more into focus in, as Eric said, a way that we hope we can keep kind of simple, because it sure is easy to overcomplicate.
That's absolutely true. Some of those questions are fairly deep and existential, I have to tell you, okay? Particularly for a junior or senior in high school. Now, you also talk a lot about cost, and that's something, frankly, that's often been missing from a lot of other books that dispense admissions advice. And it could be for, an upper middle class family, cost is less an issue. Who knows? Because it costs so much today. I mean, if you send your kid to a Yale or Washington University, I mentioned those two because we've done that, you're going to be set back a good amount of money if you don't get a scholarship.
Well, I think that one of the things we acknowledge in the book is you as a parent and your child may be having, this may be the very first conversation you really have about money. Here's what we've saved for college. Here's what we're willing to spend on college. Here are some ground rules in terms of, if you want to go to a private institution, the difference between need-based aid and merit aid, and how that might factor in what we expect you to do as a child as part of this. And we think these conversations should be had at the outset, so that everybody's expectations are managed and nobody gets sort of ahead of themselves in terms of what might be possible. But we also, so we talk about the I's, which are your child, and the C's, which are that institution. So the cost is the fifth C, but we also put them in the context of the culture of an institution, the curriculum, the community, and the conclusions. What happens to students, after they leave that institution? But we think it should be right there and at the outset.
Now, the difficulty often in getting to the answers to some of the questions that you raise is, you go to a website of a university, or you go and get a brochure, and they all feel pretty much the same. They're all highly collaborative. It's a fun place to be and learn. And our faculty is second to none. And all the superlatives that every university and college uses to sell someone. How do you get to the truth of those questions?
Well, I think it's really interesting, John, in the period that we're in right now, as families are not able to visit campuses in the manner that they used to. And even for the students that we admitted back in March and needed to visit our places, what I say to families right now, because they're asking, how can I research? I said, well, most of you, when you're looking at colleges, say that you'd like to conduct some type of research, or it seems like that's a question that people raise their hand on. It's like, be a researcher, think critically. And I think even more so now, there's going to need to be that kind of that opportunity to dig underneath a little bit deeper about, why do I really want to go to this place? Am I getting on the name brand? What is it about this institution that I feel has value for me? And I could see past some of the veneer up front, because I'm really taking a look deeply into myself. I know what matters to me. And as you said, existential questions with the eyes. I think this could also be a book for graduate school as well as career changers. And so when you start really trying to be honest with yourself and answer those questions, I think then you're going to be more critical of institutions and say, you know what, I had this eye that I'm looking for, this critical eye, and I think I'm able to see a little bit more clearly why this institution may be for me or not for me.
And I think, Eric uses the researcher analogy. My career was 25 years as a journalist. We say in the book, you've got to become a journalist. You've got to have your questions and sort of doggedly figure out who to ask them of. Is it the admissions office? Is it a particular department? Is it the students at the school newspaper? And a little bit harder to do that without being able to visit, but not impossible. And I think that as you ask those questions, Eric's point about veneer, your point about them all looking the same, suddenly they're not looking so similar. Average class size, student to faculty ratio, how deep and broad are the student supports, academic resource center, tutoring center, availability of counseling. Suddenly that starts to separate a little bit, but you are, as a student and as a parent, going to have to take a little bit of ownership in that process and dig.
Now, I know the two of you aren't all that fond of the annual popularity contests, often referred to as the U.S. News ranking. But one thing it can do, at least, is to unleash a lot of these statistics that you're mentioning. And probably parsing some of that data is useful to answer some of these questions, yes?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things we say in the college conversation is, again, imagining a parent who's never dove into this before, and oh my God, it's like a refrigerator. Of course I want the number 6 rated or higher college for my kid because I want the best. I wouldn't want a refrigerator that was ranked 30th or what have you. We try to tell them to avoid that kind of framing, but we do say, to your point, there's so much good information underneath that ranking. Just resist the temptation to put stock in, oh my God, school X went up or down X number of rungs and is now tied with 5 of its peers. But yes, there's important variables that lead to that number.
Now, Eric mentioned before the notion that, of course, you can't really visit a college today. Hopefully that won't be true in a year or two. And you have a whole section on planning a college road trip. What are sort of the do's and don'ts of planning a college road trip, which also is a time, incidentally, to have these very deep conversations with your child, and just being present on a college campus and recalling your own time there could be ideal for making these conversations happen.
No, you're absolutely right. And Jacques and I were really careful as we went through the book a final time that we didn't try to adjust every section based on the reality that we were facing around the globe in February and March. Certainly in the introduction, we addressed COVID, while also we feel that, although the spaces may be different in order to have these conversations, families are still going to need to have those conversations, whether it is at a separate part of the house or a walk around the neighborhood, again, by being critical thinkers here and still having an opportunity perhaps to walk through a college campus or two, depending on local guidance and other health and safety rules, is that we want you to put yourself in that space to be open with one another. So the college road trip is much further in the book compared to that initial index card. But we
Yeah.
want you to keep going back to that and try to really ask yourself, okay, is this point still valid? Mom, do you still feel the same way? This is how I feel about this. So just again, opening up those spaces, whatever they may be.
And if you're the parent of a junior or sophomore or freshman in high school and listening to or watching this conversation, I really do feel, and I hope it's not considered naive, that this period we're in will pass, and
Yeah.
and that the college visit will resume, perhaps as soon as this spring or next fall, and it'll be different, but it will happen. And in those cases, being really careful. I have no poker face, as my children would tell you readily, but as best you can to sort of summon a poker face when you walk into that cafeteria as a parent and you think, oh my God, it's dingy. I would never eat off those tables and those plates. Try to keep that to yourself as much as possible, but also on the flip side to avoid the, oh my God, who wouldn't want to go here? I want to go here. Well, guess what? You parent, you're not the one going. On the other hand, there may come a time after there's a little space between that visit where, you really do have a perspective that your child should hear, because you have some life experience you're bringing to this, but try to resist the temptation on that trip to talk about what you would do. And that also goes in the category if you happen to be visiting your alma mater, and
Yeah.
being careful to know that it's them going, not you.
And the two of you, I'm sure, know that oftentimes those college visits, when they can be taken, can lead to very wrong conclusions. So you visit a campus on a rainy day. Suddenly, it seems less a place that you want to be than the campus you visit on a beautiful sunny day. Or you have a tour guide who's incredibly charismatic, is humorous, is engaging, versus a tour guide who just does, the routine, mundane kind of tour. And that actually can have more impact on a young person than the curriculum, than the extracurriculars, than the brand of the school and its value, than the career outcomes of the graduates. Now, a parent should maybe make those things apparent.
Yeah, I think look, it's all data, and it all needs to be taken into account. And sometimes, if you get that good feel on a tour and try to understand what's driving it, it can be a relative data point. But if with a little distance, you come back to those C's, culture, curriculum, community, conclusions, cost, suddenly that tour experience is part of a much broader set of data.
Yeah, having that framework really helps.
I've always said to families during traditional times of visiting campus that you need to know, and I still feel this is the case, you still need to know where the students are at the moment that you're visiting. And it may be the few days before the big spring festival, and gee, this is the happiest place I've ever seen. Or it's in the middle of midterms or finals, and everyone looks down and stressed. Again, having that awareness of the context of where the students and that institution is at that given time. Maybe it's readily apparent, but maybe it's not. Some other things may be going on, either with the academic calendar or just in the general environment that is influencing the students at that time.
And one of the things we say in the college conversation apropos of that is set aside the expectation of the perfect. I think sometimes students and families take this word fit, which is a fine word to use as part of the college conversation. But at a certain point, they interpreted fit as perfect fit, and it's out there for me, my perfect fit. If only I can just find it, and almost like summoning those rays of light to come from the clouds as you step through the gates of Campus X. I think if there's an acceptance of the fact that there is no perfect, that there are things you're going to like, things you're not going to like so much, and we talk at the end of the book about how to try to marshal those decisions, but. Perfect is a really dangerous threshold to try to hit when visiting these campuses.
And one of the things about the book that I actually did like is you make the point that you don't have to go to an elitist institution to get a great education and to do well in life. And, a lot of parents, particularly in middle class, upper middle class, feel that brand is probably more important than anything else. And, from a very early age, they're doing things with their children in terms of building their application from kindergarten, as we know. So in helping your child build a college list, and that's one of the things you cover in the second chapter, how do you get beyond the allure, the magic of the big brands, the Ivy Leagues, the near Ivies, the public Ivies?
I think that, and look, I readily cop to the fact that I'm a graduate of one of these institutions, Dartmouth. My writing partner is the dean of admission at one and previously worked at the other.
Yeah.
And so whoever is watching this absolutely needs to filter this answer through that background. But we do make the point in the book that there's over 2,000 four-year colleges in this country, and many more community colleges than that, and any number of pathways. And again, coming back to those simple C's, you have to factor brand into those other, sort of attributes, and ask yourself, what is it that you or your child is hoping to get out of this experience, including cost. Look, if you are a student from a low-income background, there is no question that institutions like the one that my writing partner works at can be a tremendous engine of social mobility. And it's important that families realize that sometimes that highly selective private could be more affordable even than an in-state public. But for most of us, it's important to sort of keep an open mind. And one of the books that we recommend, one of many books we recommend, is a book called Colleges That Change Lives. And this is a guidebook that's been around for a long time, that and it profiles 4 dozen or so colleges that many of your listeners and viewers may not have heard of, and makes the case for each of them, not because of the ranking or the SAT scores or the grade point averages the kids coming in, but what's the experience students have while they're there, and what happens after they leave. And but it really is hard, and I'm a parent too. It's hard to resist that temptation to go for brand. But I hope we make a compelling case in the book to cast a wide net.
And Jacques, the book you mentioned, I believe those schools were chosen on the basis of the social mobility of their graduates.
Yeah, the book Colleges That Change Lives. Even if somebody who's listening or watching their child doesn't apply to a single one of those schools, Eric and I loved the framing of how they sized up a school. And spoiler alert, it's not about the ranking. It's about the experience, and there's a criteria, a rubric that the authors of that book use that would be helpful to parents as they size up institutions.
Now you get to the point where you've built your college list, you've had your conversation with your kid over the I's and the C's, and then you get down to the nitty-gritty of standardized tests and filling out the applications. And the applications have become a lot easier in this day and age with the Common App and other things like that, as you point out in the book. And you suggest creating a deadline tracker and other things. What are some of the basics in terms of how involved the parent should be in the creation of the application to a school for their child? Should they be hands-off? Should they just be a reader of the essays at the end? What's your advice?
Our first piece of advice there was, and it's something that you'll hear admissions folks say all the time, is, the student voice really matters. And it sounds like that noise that we just say all the time. And we really believe it, though. The other part here for parent involvement, and Jacques and I were very, I think, cognizant of the fact of how much is going on in anyone's life, including the parallel universe, as we call it, of high school, is that parents should be involved with that tracker to help with deadlines, right? It's, you don't want to miss something and teach that level of independence by missing a deadline, particularly.
You need to nudge.
Exactly. It's like the little reminder that can go off. Again, Jacques and I didn't necessarily go into this part of the book thinking this way. It just developed as our conversations were developing. But what we would really like families to think about and students to think about is each component of the application as some piece of a mosaic. Here's an opportunity that could shed some light into who I am or provide some texture. And when you put all the pieces together, emerges this applicant, your child. And so, I think usually with this question, we're thinking about essays and what's editing or over editing. And I think we're very careful here to say that it's the students' reflections and own insights that are what's going to carry the conversation with the admissions office, not hearing, what we think the parent, the 50 or 60-year-old wants us to hear. And we're very careful about
And
that.
I think in Eric, you've got somebody who's read tens of thousands of college essays, literally. And I remember Eric saying to me very distinctly, I know what a 30-year-old voice sounds like. I know what a 40-year-old voice sounds like. I know what a 50-year-old voice sounds like. We don't want to hear that. And so for your listeners and viewers who may be tempted to sort of say to their child, you talk and I'll type, that gets into the question of your voice. And I think that 18 or 19-year-old voice or 17-year-old voice is very different than if you as a parent, let me take a stab at this with my vocabulary and life experience. I think as a journalist and writer that every writer needs an editor, but it's up to your child. Are you the best person for that? Is it a sibling? Is it an English teacher? Is it a friend? And if it's you as a parent, don't, in your editing, blot out that voice.
Now, Jacques, you just recently went through this process with your son, maybe, or daughter?
I have a daughter who just graduated and a son who's midway through his college years.
Now, did you help them decide what topics to write about for their essays?
It was funny. I wish they could join us right now, but I would say in the case of one of them, there was very little interest in what I might have to say about all this, which I thought was phenomenal. And bravo. And in the spirit of the book, in terms of guardrails and guidelines, with another, a little more interest, but in both cases, I don't know that I saw either of their essays before they went out the door, and they sort of knew I was there. But in the spirit of voice, I think I gave them the confidence that their voices were that they were really capable of having that shine through. And they each had, friends and teachers read, but with that guideline of making sure, don't touch this too much.
Wow. Eric, what do you think of that? That's impressive, because if I had a dad who worked for the New York Times for 25 years, I'd be incredibly tempted to seek his guidance and advice and absolutely edit my essays.
I think what's amazing is, and this is where I really hope the book can be helpful, is that in any roles that we have, if we're seen as the expert in it, we have to be really careful, because they could really go sideways for your own child.
Yes.
You want to be really careful about, just recognizing that. And I think in any profession that has to be, considered. So it's even the writing process. This is where we really pushed each other about being a professional writer and a professional reader, if you will. And we really had fun playing off each other that way, while also understanding, and maybe I'll leave it with this. This might be a real pearl for some families. Jacques said to me, Eric, and after we read this book how many times with editors, there's going to be a mistake in the book. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There's going to be a mistake in the book. For the students and families, there's going to be maybe a quote unquote mistake in your essay. Don't over edit so much, let it go at some point. And maybe that's the piece of advice, which, by the way, when we did the audiobook, I was reading through half of it, because we split the book up for the audiobook, and what did I find? Couple typos, couple mistakes. It happens.
Inevitable. And then it's more authentic and genuine, or an overbearing parent who's too involved in the process, right?
Yeah, and I would take it a step further, and sorry, I didn't mean to step on you, John.
No, please.
But also, you just are. So apropos of that essay, and just as there's not going to be a perfect fit, and there's not going to be a perfectly edited essay, you are not going to be the perfect parent in this process, and you're going to be human, and you're going to be as good as you can be in this incredibly emotional process, where there are some things out of your control, some things in your control. You're dealing with a 17 or 18-year-old and all the emotion that they bring to it. Mm-hmm. I think just knowing at the outset that this is not going to be perfect and you aren't either. I hope there's something freeing in that. I certainly, I made mistakes vis-a-vis my own kids in this process. I accept that I'm as human as any other parent embarking on this.
And the last two conversations in the book are around the decisions. Once you get your admits, where do you actually go and how do you come to that decision? And then finally, the conversations about the big transition, because for many of these children, they've never lived away from home. And now suddenly they have total freedom and independence. And that can unravel people, particularly in the very beginning of a college experience. But let's start with the conversation about the decisions. Is there a framework for deciding? I mean, basically, you've already established the things that should be important to you, and they should be reinforced when you get your admits, right?
Well, we had a lot of fun with this section too. Each section evolved. What Jacques taught me is you need a really strong outline. And once we went into the actual decision process, and there's two decisions being made. The admissions office made decisions on your applications, but then you had the opportunity now to make the decision about which one you choose. And we really put this in the light that after building a college list, right, Jacques, that they probably have 3 or 4 choices to choose from. And we had fun with trying to put together how to then put together the I's and the C's and go back to the index card in order to really, again, try to see which ones of these are even more relevant now that I'm going to be able to choose one school. Remember doing that exercise, Jacques? I mean, that was kind of fun as we were envisioning.
Yeah, I mean, we had an aspiration to go beyond just a pro-con list because we thought this was a section that required a little more nuance, a little more complexity. And what if we're both very visual people and we're both sort of old school in terms of graph paper, but certainly spreadsheets and Google Docs can work too. But what if you went back and looked at, hey, in terms of C's and I's, the qualities about you, the qualities about them, this is the universe now, this is my list. How do these schools measure up in terms of my criteria? And as Eric says, have my criteria shifted? And cost has to be very much a part of that conversation. That sounds unbelievable, that particular school, but it's $20,000 more with aid than those other 3 schools. There's a place at the table for that conversation. So hopefully we found a framing for that.
The other thing that I imagine happens is that after you do your research and you are the journalist asking these questions of admission directors, students, alumni, faculty, what have you, your ideas about what you want probably evolve.
That's right.
And they become more definite and you become more thoughtful about your decision so that in fact, just going back to the index card in that early conversation, you may have different things that would be on the index card, I imagine, when you actually have to decide, here's where I want to go.
Yeah, and look, you're dealing with a 17 or 18-year-old, and sometimes that index card changes from the moment of deposit, which takes place, late April, early May, and when you arrive on campus, and throughout that year, you're changing and evolving. And one of the things we cover in the 5th and final section is what happens when your child comes to you over Thanksgiving or Christmas and says, you know what, this was where I was, but my priorities and values have changed, and I think I want to make a switch. And we try to arm parents for that conversation, which is a very understandable and real conversation. Ultimately, you can't know until you go. And even when you go, you may change.
Yeah, that's really true. Now, that's a frightening conversation, really. Given the amount of time one invests in that decision, and I know people who've had that situation, very difficult, really.
Yeah, and we really tried to sort of tone that down. There's a very high percentage of students in this country that would surprise a lot of your viewers who do wind up graduating from an institution different than the institution where they started at. And we tried to, that's not a failure on your part as a parent. To the contrary, your child made the best decision they could with the information they had and where they were at that moment. And then they changed and then it got real. And so I think, Eric, we took a little bit of the fear out of the transfer conversation.
Absolutely, and it could even be part of a planned, track for a student. So we really wanted to open it up as wide as possible, while also, because I'm already seeing this now with some young people who are on college campuses or on college campuses and studying remotely in that college campus. What are they feeling now? Let's really, bring this to kind of our current situation, and we want to make sure that the conversations that these parents are having with these children is to understand that there's a lot going on here, and let's not jump to any judgments right now. We need to take a little more time.
Now, as anxiety ridden as this process is, I think the peak of the emotions are felt on the day that you move your child into a college and you say goodbye. Having done that 5 times in my life, consoling hysterical mothers and children at times, and controlling my own emotions. Boy, that's a really hard thing a lot of times to say goodbye, because to me it does mark, and you mentioned this is transition into adulthood. So it does mark the end of a phase, an important phase of intimacy and engagement with your child that will never be the same again. Well, what's your advice to that parent who's dropping off that child and walking away from that dorm room to get in the car to drive away?
Yeah, I mean, it's that I get a lump in my throat having done it twice, not 5 times, just hearing you say it. But I think the idea that accepting that it is going to be different, and we do, the whole 5th part of the book is that first year. And I think Eric and I spent a lot of time thinking about trying to establish a new set of guidelines and guardrails, and making sure that there were regular check-ins, and that worked for you and your child. Saturday morning after a Friday night is probably not the best time for your child to check in with you, but finding time for those regular check-ins, and then making sure to ask those questions that will get your parental radar engaged. I mean, a high percentage of students who go off to college experience depression or symptoms of depression at some point. You as a parent, you need to poke a little bit and listen, because nobody's going to pick that up perhaps as well as you might. And if you hear something that gives you pause on that, try to work with your child to avail themselves of the support services that exist on campus.
Right. Okay, now having written this book, I want you to do something for me. I want you to transport yourselves back to high school and think about the decisions that you made and where you actually went to college. And does it really sync with the book? Probably not, right? Because you're much more learned and have much more wisdom about this now than you certainly could have had back then.
I'm going to put my writing partner on the spot first, and then I'll go next.
Well, when I talk about, jotting words down on the index card with families, I'm always cautious about saying and careful about saying, Eric's 18-year-old self might have put this down, but I really can't transport myself back because I really did not know. I think I had one sense of what I wanted out of college, and that was that I grew up in a rural area, and that going to an urban institution was probably something I would prefer. It's not that all schools that I applied to were in urban settings.
Yes.
But that there was something there, which then when I was able to visit after I was admitted, I did not walk through Penn's campus until after decisions were rendered. But something did strike at that point. I'll point out something, though, that maybe should have gone the opposite way. And that is, I went to an institution that is in a city, yes, with also, I forget how many at the time, but let's say 8,000 to 10,000 students. I probably intellectually, one of the eyes, would have been better served at a smaller institution. At least it would have made my first couple of years more comfortable. For the longer term trajectory, the conclusions, I'm not going to complain, certainly. Here I am sitting in the office of the admission dean. But if I was honest with myself, a smaller environment might have been better for me.
Interesting. And Jacques, you still would have gone to Hanover. Come on,
So I grew up in a small town of 15,000 in southeastern Massachusetts, where half the kids at my public high school, which I attended, somehow I knew then did not go on to four-year institutions. And for me, I sort of had to, in many ways, be my own college counselor. My mom grew up in New Brunswick, Canada, is a registered nurse. This whole process that we have was completely alien to her, coming from Canada and being trained as a nurse. But for me, if I think of the C's and the I's, sense of place was everything to me. I wanted to be in northern New England. I wanted to be 4 hours north of where I grew up. I wanted to be in the mountains, and I wanted an intellectually rigorous and challenging environment. But that was my universe. And so I actually do think, if I hadn't been so fortunate to be admitted to Dartmouth, which I probably would not be the case today, there's so many wonderful liberal arts colleges in northern New England, whether in Maine, Vermont, New Hampshire, or in western Massachusetts, that I think that these the C's and the I's would have gotten me there, I think.
I bet. Now, one last question for Jacques, having gone through the process recently. And Eric, I think your children are too young yet, right?
Correct.
Yeah. So, Jacques, would you have done anything differently as a result of writing this book and talking to Eric through it with your own children that you didn't do?
I was, a colleague of ours, Jennifer Delahunty of Eric's and mine, wrote a book with the title. I've sort of referenced it earlier. The title is perfect. I'm going to college, not you. And you can imagine, your child saying that to you as well they should. And I constantly, it was all but a mantra for me to remember that was the case as my children were going through this process. What would I have done differently? I think just even further doubling down on that, trying to have a little bit more of a poker face, both literally and figuratively, and just remembering it was them, and that it's really hard to spare them disappointment and confusion, and helping them whittle decisions, and just, I think that having written the book, I'm even more aware that while there's a lot we can do as parents, there's a lot that can and should be out of our control.
Really good advice. I come back to your tour of a dining facility, seeing it dirty and keeping your mouth shut. Jacques and Eric, it's been a true pleasure. Congratulations on the book. I think it's actually, if you are a first-generation college student, and maybe your parents aren't going to be as much into this, perhaps, this book is as good for you in guiding you as a young person who's going through this experience and may not have role models or other people to rely upon as it is for your parents, because of the exercises and how gently you guide both parents and students through the process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John.
Thanks.
So for all of you, that's the College Conversation, a practical companion for parents to guide their children along the path to higher education. And it's published by Viking Penguin. It's out on September 22nd. It's a terrific guide that brings you step by step through the journey, and may make it a little bit easier and more productive for both you and your children. This is John Byrne with Poets and Quants. Thanks for watching.